Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to the Baker Institute this evening for a special discussion on United States policy options toward Syria. I want to recognize our many friends in the audience and Deborah and Mark Tice, who are with us also, and we're very happy to have you all here. Syria is obviously in a crisis and a challenge we are all very painfully familiar with. We see it on the front page of our newspapers each morning and the leading news on our televisions each night. Remarkable today, the first news item was Aleppo, and the second was Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State designate. Since Syria's uprising began in 2011, the country has devolved into a civil war and a humanitarian disaster with regional and global consequences. Thousands have been killed, millions displaced internally and externally. Radical groups have spawned with destabilizing and dangerous consequences for the country, the region, and the world at large. Presently, Syrian government forces are taking control of the rebel-held districts in Aleppo. A victory would give President Assad control of the country's largest cities and the more populated western part of the country. But such a victory may also be Pyrrhic. The Syrian government and its benefactors will be attempting to assert control over an economically and socially devastated country with debilitated political institutions, millions of internally displaced people, deep sectarian distrust, and low-level insurgencies which seem likely to last for years. In short, the autocratic system which held the country together for decades is much weaker and may no longer be viable in the long term. So in addressing Syria, the Trump administration faces a daunting task. President-elect Trump has made it clear that defeating ISIS is his primary goal. In pursuing this policy, the new administration must consider the day-after scenarios. And I can't stress that enough. It cannot overlook the importance of Syria's geopolitical role in the Arab world. Ideally, and I want to stress ideally, a post-conflict Syria would achieve a successful transition towards sustainable governance and stability in a diverse and multi-ethnic society. Equally important is the need to understand the long-term implications of a regional order which has undoubtedly changed as a result of the conflicts in the region in the past years. So addressing the complex landscape in Syria was the goal of today's working group here at the Baker Institute. We met all day with this very distinguished group to really analyze, debate, and try to seek ideas on the way forward in Syria. We have with us some of the leading minds on Syria from the worlds of diplomacy and academia. And my invitation to this distinguished group was the thought that if this group couldn't see the way forward, no one could. But let me tell you before we even start, it's complicated. And Ryan Crocker mentioned this. He reminded me that one of the mottos of the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department is that when anyone asks you a complex question, you say, it's complicated. So the situation in Syria is complicated. Ambassador Ryan Crocker served as, and you have the biographies, you have detailed biographies in your program, served as United States Ambassador to Syria from 1998 to 2001. In his 37-year Foreign Service career, he also served as U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Kuwait, and Lebanon. When I was working in the State Department with Ryan, I couldn't keep him in Washington. He always would seek a foreign service assignment. I finally got him to Washington, and then I put out a notice in the NAE Bureau, we need a volunteer to be our special envoy to Afghanistan. Guess who the first person was in front of my desk? Ambassador Crocker recently retired as Dean of the George Herbert Walker Bush School of Government and Public Services, Texas A&M University. Another distinguished panelist, Ambassador Robert Ford, served as United States Ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014, and U.S. Ambassador to Algeria from 2006 to 2008. In 2014, Ambassador Ford retired from the U.S. Foreign Service after 30 years' service. He was very much in the news during his assignment to Syria and did some very courageous and brave forays into the country during a time of great turbulence, and a very proud example of the Foreign Service. He's currently a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he writes about developments in the Levant and North Africa. Dr. Joshua Landis is director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He is the writer of the well-known Syria Comment, a daily newsletter on Syrian politics. Dr. Landis is a frequent advisor to government agencies and research institutes on Syrian politics and a true expert on Syria. Charles Lister is a senior fellow, even though he looks very young, at the Middle East Institute. He is a senior consultant to Sheikh Group's Track 2 Syria initiative, through which he has helped coordinate a 2-year process of engagement with the leadership of over 100 Syrian armed opposition groups. He was formerly a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center in Qatar. Charles Lister's book, The Syrian Jihad, was published in 2015. Dr. Rhonda Slim is director of the Track 2 Dialogues Initiative at the Middle East Institute and an adjunct fellow, research fellow at the New America Foundation. She is a long-term practitioner of Track 2 dialogue and peace-building processes in the Middle East, and is the co-founder of the Arab Network for the Study of Democracy, a group of academics and civil society activists from 8 Arab countries. And finally, Andrew Tabler is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he focuses on Syria and U.S. policy in the Levant. Mr. Tabler served as co-founder and editor-in-chief of Syria Today, Syria's very first private English-language magazine. He also served as a consultant on U.S.-Syria relations for the International Crisis Group and as a director of editorials for Oxford Business Group. Each of the panelists will make a brief 5-minute statement on he or she sees the situation in Syria and the priorities for the Trump administration. After which I will lead the discussion with you, the audience. Question cards have been placed in your seats for you to fill out and hand to your staff, so I encourage you to, our staff, and I encourage you to do that. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. I now turn the first presentation to be made by Ambassador Crocker.
Thanks, Ed, and welcome to all of you. It's complicated. You have before you 3 former U.S. ambassadors to Syria, Ambassador Juridian, Ambassador Ford, and myself. So collectively, as you look at us and as you look out at Syria, one way or the other, I guess we're all responsible, huh?
That's true. You blame it on us.
I'm going to sketch a pretty broad picture here of the region and the U.S. engagement in the region. This year, 2016, is the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, in which the British and the French basically carved up the Middle East into their areas of influence. We were not a player in that, although President Wilson did form a commission to go out and ask the peoples of the region what they wanted in a post-Ottoman Empire future. Not surprisingly, the majority wanted to be independent, but recognized that might not be immediately possible. Their second choice was for a single mandate for all of the Ottoman territories run by the United States. The Commission further recommended that Congress approve such a mandate, limit it in time, and make it its mission specific to preparing the peoples of that region for self-governance. Well, that did not happen. The British and the French marched forward and began almost a 100-year process that we are still in today as to how these lands should be governed. If I had to summarize the woes of the Middle East in a single word, that word would be governance. The British and the French, they were not interested in preparing anybody for anything that might look like independence. And so began a long chain of what I call failed isms. Colonialism with the British and the French. Monarchism in core Arab countries like Iraq, Egypt, Libya. Arab nationalism personified by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Arab socialism, communism, straight-out authoritarianism. They all have one thing in common. They failed at governance. They failed to provide a reliable rule of law for their peoples. They failed to provide educational and economic opportunities. They failed to build respected institutions. So broadly speaking, as you look at the chaos of the Middle East today, think governance. And the region is chaotic. 3 completely failed states, Libya, Syria, Yemen, others teetering on the brink. So the next administration will have a major challenge, to understate it considerably. And let me then just add a word about the U.S. in the region and in the world. As I said, we played no role whatsoever in the Middle East after World War I. World War II was a different matter. Conscious of what had happened when we did not lead in 1919, we definitely were going to lead in 1945. The United Nations system was created in San Francisco. The post-war international financial order was created at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Not only did we establish these institutions, we led them through a succession of presidencies. Now, what I would suggest to you is that from Harry Truman in 1945 through George W. Bush, successive presidents followed a policy of small L liberal interventionism. We were there, we were engaged, we were going to lead. In 2008, we started down a different route. That maybe the Middle East and other regions should look after their own problems. We don't need to be the world's policeman. We have resource needs here at home. Valid points all, but that was a policy departure from where we had been from 1945 up to the presidency of Barack Obama. And you see some of the consequences of this. The worst refugee crisis to hit the world since World War II, not our problem. Let the Europeans and the Middle Easterners handle it. That has brought Europe to its weakest point since the end of World War II. So I just toss that out there because I hope very much that the Trump administration will give very serious consideration to where the U.S. needs to be in the Middle East and in the world. What are our interests? What challenges do we face? What allies will we face them with? So,
very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. Robert.
Ed, thank you very much for the invitation to be here tonight in Houston. It's a huge honor to be on a panel with experts and former colleagues like Ryan, and so thank you very much for the invitation. I think if there was one problem from hell that people in government had seen over the last decade, I think we'd all say it was Syria. There are no easy choices on Syria now, and there are no risk-free options, and there are no quick fixes, and there are no sure fixes. And so we've been talking, all of us up here today, pretty interesting and lively discussions, and I've certainly learned quite a bit from some of the other members of this panel. I think the way I see it is that although we don't have huge interests in Syria the way we do in some countries in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia or Israel, we certainly do have interests, and some important ones. Ryan just mentioned the cohesion of the European Union. I was just in Germany a few weeks ago after the election, and the strain that the inflow of refugees in 2015 caused in Germany has altered Germany's politics. It's encouraged a far-right party in Germany. They may not win, but they're certainly more influential than they used to be. Same is happening in countries like France and Britain, Poland, even countries like Denmark and Sweden. Far-right government in Sweden, far-right government in Denmark, we have them now, and it's in large part because of the flow of refugees out of the Middle East and, above all, Syrians. Of course, terrorism is a concern of ours emanating out of Syria. You know that the horrible attacks in Brussels were planned in Syria. In fact, today the United States military announced they killed 2 of the people involved in the operation in Paris with a drone strike. Brussels as well had a horrible terrorism attack, again traced back to Syria. We have at least 1 American citizen being held in Syria, and they're probably, in the wake of the fighting in Aleppo, there are probably more Syrian American citizens who are now being held. And sometimes people say, well, the Americans aren't involved, they need to get involved. But in fact, the Americans are involved. We have now spent over $6 billion, that's with a B, $6 billion on refugee assistance. No end in sight. $1.5 billion a year for the last 4 years. We have 500 U.S. troops on the ground in Syria now. And we do regular combat airstrikes every day or two. Probably the military operations are costing somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million now over the last 2 years. No end in sight for that either. If you're wondering, like, well, $6 billion, is that a lot of money? Here's a comparison. Federal government aid to the city of Chicago, all told, about $400 million. So we're spending a lot on refugee assistance. And where does it end? So there is no, as I said, there is no easy answer. But here's some things I'd put out for the next administration. Number 1, I know what the president-elect said during the campaign, but working with Bashar al-Assad to address the security problems, the terrorism problems in Syria, in my opinion, would make things much worse. It would be far, far better to double down and work with our NATO ally, Turkey, difficult ally, but a NATO ally, and our ally, Saudi Arabia, another difficult ally, and yet countries that in the past have provided stability, and we need stability in the Middle East now when we have failed states in places like Libya, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. Second point, Iranian expansionism, pushing its influence, is turning out to be very destabilizing. The Israelis, for example, I was talking last night to several Israeli diplomats. They're extremely concerned now about the Israeli northern border and the presence, intensified presence of Iranian and Hezbollah personnel. We've seen a horrible battle in Aleppo, and I think it's also incumbent on us, after that battle, to rethink the American approach towards the Syrian opposition, whom we have given on again, off again assistance over the last couple of years. I don't think the current approach is working very well, and I hope the new team reevaluates that assistance. Finally, one last thing. I'm going home to Vermont tomorrow. Vermont is getting ready to welcome its first group of Syrian refugees, assuming the new administration allows them to come in. I think in the wake of what is the worst refugee crisis since World War II, the Americans must lead in providing additional refugee assistance, and it is expensive, I understand that. And I also think, as unpopular as it is in many parts of the country, that we need to admit more Syrian refugees, not fewer. Can't ask the Germans, can't ask the French, can't ask the Italians, can't ask the Greeks, can't ask the Turks, can't ask the Lebanese to do more if we don't do more. That's what leadership is. So I look forward to a good discussion tonight. Thank you again, Ed, for having me.
Thank you very much, Robert. Joshua Landis.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I believe what we're seeing what we will see after the Battle of Aleppo is the imposition of a new security architecture in the northern Middle East. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, all with pro-Iranian regimes, and some Russian backing, of course, US backing in Iraq. And that is likely to be a new security architecture for the next several decades. In some ways, it's a return to 19th century diplomacy of spheres of influence. As the United States withdraws from some of the regions that in the world, we're going to see Russia carve out a bigger sphere of influence. In the South China Sea, China is already doubling its defense expenditures. India, other places are doing the same thing. And America cannot spend the kind of money and do what it used to do in order to preserve its predominance in all these regions. And so let me touch on three things. One, why is Assad winning? Two, will Assad reconquer all the country? And three, what should the US do? Why did Assad win? Why is he winning? I would say there are four major arguments. One, this was not just a Syria war. Many of us thought that Assad would fall because in a war of attrition, his supporters, particularly the Alawites, 12% of the country, were a minority. And that if the Sunni opposition could go on long enough, with enough volunteers coming into the country and Saudi support, they would wear him down. But it turned into a regional war. Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, Iran, all the Shiite powers jumped in on his behalf. There are actually more Shiite Arabs in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq than there are Sunni Arabs. So demographically, with the assist of his Shiite neighbors, he's been able to preserve this pro-Iranian dominance here, which Iran sees as key. Two, opposition was terrible, very fragmented. CIA said over 1,500 different groups. They could never unify. Now, Charles Lister tried to help them unify and worked at this assiduously, but it ultimately never happened. Three, Salafist and Caliphalism predominated in a right side of the wing, which turned the West against their own allies. Because of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other Salafist groups became so powerful, the three different iterations of American support for moderates failed, and they were conquered and their arms taken away by these more Salafist, which eventually caused Russia and Assad to begin winning the narrative. You are supporting terrorists. That's what they kept on saying. Four, friends. Assad had better friends. Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, and particularly the Russian Air Force. The Russian Air Force turned it around for Assad. We've seen, since the 1967 war, air forces win. And we certainly saw that in the Gulf War and our present war against ISIS. You need to dominate this 365 good weather days in the Middle East with a desert. There's no place to hide. So that's why Assad is winning. Will he retake the whole country? I believe he will. We have disputes here about that within our own meeting, but I think that there are no rebel forces that can withstand a growing power of Syrian army with Russian backing and the backing of his neighbors. I think Saudi Arabia is going to lose interest in this. Turkey is going to want to go back to making money and not fighting an insurgency, and the West is already turning away. They feel that the rebels have lost. What should the U.S. do? Here's another dispute. A number of us think that the U.S. should turn its back on Syria because Assad is so distasteful. It's a brutal dictatorship. And that we should let Russia and Iran try to get Assad back up. I think that would be a mistake. Our policy towards Syria since '76 has been sanctions to try to punish and reduce Syrian GDP growth by perhaps 2% a year, thinking that they would break relations with Hezbollah, break relations with Iran, make peace with Israel, and turn towards the West. Something, democracy promotion. I don't know what our total objectives were, but they were big objectives. It failed. What it did help produce is an explosion that was driven by, in part, the impoverishment of the countryside. I don't think that it's in America's interest to impoverish people. Even if democracy promotion ultimately is only going to come about if people move into the middle class, get a decent education. America can do two things, I think. We have very limited influence, and we're going to have very limited influence in Syria. We can help with education, which Syria needs desperately. Everybody wants an American-style education. We can help the ICRC, the Red Cross, try to get into Syrian prisons. They were maybe not on the verge, but they were working on this before the uprising started. If the US were to lift sanctions or to offer a negotiation over that, to get people into the prisons, to count prisoners, get regular visits to prisoners, so that the kind of brutality we've seen is alleviated even a little bit, I think it would be something America could do. Rather than turning our backs on this regime, as we did with Vietnam for 20 years after losing there, or we did with China for many decades after losing there, we could turn our backs and say, we don't want anything to do with you. I don't think that's the right, because we need refugees to go home. We need the new generation of Syrians to get an education. And I think those are the only ways to end terrorism and the terrible plight of Syrians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Charles Lister.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a real honor to be involved in the discussions all day and to be on this panel. The title of this event was Syria Policy Options for the Trump Administration. So I thought what I'd try and talk about early on more are some certain ground truths that the Trump administration is going to face with regards to Syria. And I think we couldn't be sitting here at any more of a timely point watching events unfold in Aleppo as kind of haunting and brutal as they've been. I've been troubled sitting in Washington, D.C. on and off for the last few weeks by the amount of times I've heard people suggest that the fall of Aleppo represents the end of Syria's conflict. Nothing could be further from the truth, sadly. No matter how you want to read that. The fact remains the Assad regime itself has a fundamental manpower problem, existing, though not often public, Russian assessments of the Syrian army is that there are currently only roughly 20 to 25,000 deployable, as in offensively deployable soldiers for the entire country. And what we've seen develop as a result of that is a vast paramilitary and militia structure, which by and large now in places like Aleppo is being staffed primarily by non-Syrians. This isn't a long-term solution to the Syrian conflict. Yes, Joshua may very well be right that in the long term, in the next 3 years or so, it might be feasible that that vast, complicated, pro-Assad armed structure may be capable of taking back significant additional portions of its own territory. But again, as I say, this question what that represents. In a sense, foreigners controlling newly captured territory, 5 million Syrian refugees currently out of the country, who I can guarantee the vast majority of those individuals will never consider coming back to Syria so long as those kind of individuals are controlling their homes, their hometowns, and, dare I say it, so long as the Assad regime is still in power. And Russia, of course, has its own limits as well. What's been witnessed in the last few days and not necessarily got the media coverage that it deserves is that whilst the Aleppo conflagration is going on, the town of Palmyra has been lost to ISIL or Daesh again for the second time in 18 months. The interesting thing here was the Russian military contingent that was based in the town and just outside the town fled or evacuated a week before the town fell. Just, listen to that a little bit. The Assad regime itself, its main Syrian army fighters left the day before the town fell and left the final defense towards the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and a series of militias. Not only has Palmyra fallen, but in the last 48 hours, a vast swathe of territory in central Syria has fallen under ISIL control. Just today, they took control of several surface-to-air missile systems, the kind of military equipment that the opposition doesn't have. One of the main points I wanted to make here in terms of my area of work, which is more on the conflict and the military actors, is that ISIS is not a defeated power. Much as the United States government, and I speak here as an American, makes a very big deal about the victories we are winning against ISIL, and they are right, we are winning. We have a very long way to go in fighting ISIL in Syria. And I would argue, in fact, we've not actually fought any of the hard battles against ISIL in Syria yet. All of those battles still lie ahead of us. And that's going to be a very significant challenge. The second thing I wanted to talk about is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Syria in the last 5 years has adopted a completely changed, evolved modus operandi, a completely different strategy for operating in an unstable environment than what we've seen Al-Qaeda develop and implement in other areas of the world. And this is very much to our detriment. So Al-Qaeda, to put it simply, and I could talk about this for a very long time, but to put it simply, they've acted in a way that I've described in the past as in controlled pragmatism. And in that I mean they have developed a policy which focuses on treating an environment and the people that live within it as infants. This is the kind of language Al-Qaeda's global strategists started talking about around roughly 2008, 2009. And generally the message was, when you enter into an area that you haven't existed in before, the people who live there are essentially babies, they're infants. They haven't been brought up to know what it feels like or to live in a pure Islamic society. They don't know how to behave in a pure Islamic society. So don't walk into that town and chop off a young man's arm for stealing an apple on day one, because you'll immediately develop enemies and your project there won't last beyond the immediate term. And so what we've seen in Syria is a much more quote-unquote pragmatic, but controlled pragmatic strategy, which is focused on building alliances, avoiding enemies, and deeply embedding itself into existing kind of revolutionary sentiments and narratives. And so in a sense, we have an Al-Qaeda organization now in Syria which is so deeply embedded that any US counterterrorism action against it only reinforces its narrative on the ground, only further encourages other individuals who currently right now want nothing to do with Al-Qaeda in the long term to see Al-Qaeda as their best ally on the ground. And given losses in Aleppo, I fear that kind of situation will only continue. And moreover, I also fear if the Trump administration follows through on what the president-elect has at least threatened in public in terms of withdrawing all support from the armed opposition, what we will see is not just a further strengthening of that Al-Qaeda narrative, but a cementing of it. And that's a very, very, very dangerous scenario, not just with regards to where some Syrians might sit in terms of the long-term future of their own allegiances, but also with regards to where certain regional states might stand with regards to this de facto affiliate on the ground and whether or not it necessarily deserves support. So I think there are these kind of ground truths that we are going to have to face up to and the Trump administration will have to face, which don't necessarily add up to all of the positions that the president-elect has suggested he would like to follow through on when he comes into office. They're all very inconvenient truths, but nevertheless they're ones we're going to have to deal with. And as Ambassador Ford said very clearly, dealing with any of these truths is going to necessitate getting our hands dirty to some extent, and taking risks. If we choose to pull out altogether, I'm fairly confident we'll have to go into Syria much more strongly than we already are now to deal with the kind of issues that will have created themselves in the vacuum that we'll leave behind.
Thank you very much. And Charles, and now Rhonda Slim.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you to Ambassador Georgian and the Baker Institute for inviting me to this event and for a very interesting discussion today, and I look forward to an interesting discussion with the audience. Being the only person on the panel who hails from the region, the Middle East, I thought I will bring a regional perspective to my remarks. And building also on what my colleagues here on the panel have said in terms of whether Aleppo and the win for the regime in Aleppo, and it's definitely a military and a political win for the Assad regime, whether this will be the end of the war in Syria. And Syrian officials have already declared themselves this is not going to be the end of the war. And the claim, the objective of Assad is to retake Syria, inch by inch, village by village, and I think he will continue to be doing that. But does this really bring an end of the war to addressing the root causes of what brought Syria to a citizen uprising in 2011? And what happened in Syria in 2011 was very much part of a wave of citizen uprisings in the region, as you well know, that started in Tunisia in 2010, and then you had, Egypt and Yemen and Libya and Syria. And what are the drivers for these citizen uprising? And the driver is very much about the social contract, a social contract that has existed in the region in many of these countries for generations has come undone. And any regime that is unable to move forward and reform itself is going to have to continue to deal with these root causes of what brought this citizen uprising. And that's why I don't see the war in Syria to end with the Aleppo win, particularly because the main driver of the citizen uprising, of what brought Syrian citizens, Syrian youth to the streets, demands for dignity, demands for freedom, demand to be free from security services, demand to be free, to decide their lives, are still there. And more importantly, it's a regime that has been able to stay in place for years and years because of fear, because of what, and this ability to be able to rule by fear. And that element of fear has disappeared, not only in Syria, but somewhere else. And so this driver will continue to fuel in a situation of instability and fragility, despite the kind of military wins that we have seen in Aleppo today and yesterday. Now, the second driver of the citizen uprisings, and of what we are seeing in the region, especially in Syria, and that has gained over time a more prominent role, is this power competition that exists in the region, that's unfolding in the region between especially Iran and Saudi Arabia for regional influence. We always talk about it in terms of sectarian dimensions and sectarian identities, but at its heart is really a competition for political power between these two regionals, using sectarian language, sectarian narrative in order to mobilize and fuel people's participation and people commitments to the cause. And that kind of power competition We have seen it throughout the history of the region, and especially recent history of the region. It's going to go up and it goes down, and today it is at its height, but that will continue in Syria, and as it will continue otherwise in other places. And as long as we are not addressing, or this kind of competition is not addressed in a way that satisfies the interest of both of these countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think we're going to see other civil wars, and we are going to see war in Syria to continue. Now, the second important, the second aspect that I would like to talk about here, building on what my colleagues have said, is the lessons that are now being drawn from the Aleppo victory, and the lessons that are being drawn in the region by other, let's put it, autocrats and by other leaders of authoritarian regimes, is that basically you have to dig in. You can kill your way out of a crisis. You don't have to reform. And if you have the right allies, as Joshua said, you will be able to survive whatever challenge it has to your authority. And so that's going to make it harder going forward for any kind of citizen uprising to lead to the kind of change that the regime, that the region needs. But it's going to also, doesn't mean that it's going to prevent this kind of citizen movements from happening, but it's going to push more toward this idea of working from within, evolution rather than revolution. The final point I want to make is the consequence of the Syria war, which is at the regional level, and that's the refugee crisis, which some of the panelists have referred to. In the region, we are already talking about a second diaspora. The first diaspora being the Palestinian diaspora. Today we are talking about the second diaspora. You have in a country of 4 million like Lebanon, 1.2 to 1.3 million Syrian refugees. And as Charles has said, most of these people are not going home, especially if Assad stays in place. They left Syria because they either fought Assad, or they are the relatives of fighters of Assad, or they felt they felt not secure in the areas where they lived under regime control. And so what are the implications for host countries? Countries like Lebanon, countries like Jordan, countries like Turkey, countries like Iraq, which host some refugees. And there is a need for some new thinking about how to deal with the refugee crisis. So far, it has been on a country-by-country basis. It has been short-term. It has been tackled from a humanitarian perspective. And what's needed going forward, assuming that most of these refugees are not going to go home, is to think about this crisis in terms of a regional approach, long-term developmental approach. The countries in the region, especially the host countries, are either in denial phase, like in Lebanon, for example, believing that, they are going to go back, we don't have to deal with it. Or they are very much focusing on the here and now and the short term. And that's where I think the US going forward can help in promoting that kind of regional level process where the issue of the Syrian refugees is tackled at the regional level in a long-term developmental approach. And to start moving the perception in the region from looking at refugees as liabilities, as a drain on the local economies, and more creating opportunities for jobs, creating opportunities for refugees to create businesses, and shifting the mindset again about refugees as a liability, as a drain, to look at the refugees as resources and assets that can help drive the economy in these host countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Now, last but not least, Andrew Tabler. You've got 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Dirijian. I had a chance to meet with the ambassador a few years ago while doing some research on a book on Syria, and your insights are really invaluable for those of us that have struggled and looked at Syria over time, and that at the Baker Institute as well have really been great contributions to the policy discussion, despite being down here in Houston. Unlike Randa, I'm not from the Middle East. You probably figured that out already. I did spend 15 years living in it, and 7 years of those in Syria, which help inform my comments. I'm going to try and break this down as someone who's from my hometown, which is Oil City, Pennsylvania, which used to be home to Pennzoil and Quaker State before you all stole them from us and turned my town into the Flint, Michigan of the oil industry. The main reason why you should care about Syria has often been talked about in terms of the humanitarian dimension, and that has been accentuated by the fall of Aleppo in the last 24 hours. And the humanitarian dimension and the disaster there is really unfathomable, as many of my colleagues have talked about. But the main reason why Syria should worry you right now are two things. One is terrorism, and the other one is migrants. Assad's basically just taken Aleppo, but at the same time, as Charles pointed out, has lost control of Palmyra and the areas near Hama. Why? Because the regime does not have deployable manpower to retake its territory. And its territory means retaking the remaining two-thirds that are currently outside of its control. What those that do advocate letting Assad blast his way out of it do not tell you is they put the timetable at his retaking the country in years, not months. Given the threat of terrorism and migrants coming out of Syria, a Trump administration and the American people don't have that kind of time. We have to act faster. So what do we do? The new Iranian-dominated security architecture that Josh outlined is extremely brutal, but it's also quite rickety, and it's not something that the U.S. should bet on if it really truly wants to leave the Middle East in peace and have the Middle East leave us in peace as well. Americans shouldn't impoverish people, and we're not the main reason why people in Syria are poor, but it shouldn't reward those who use strategic weapons to gas their own people into submission through sanctions. We shouldn't deliver sanctions relief to them without a clear change in regime behavior and a strategy to put the country back together again. That would be paying it forward. It wouldn't be wise, and it's not a wise negotiating position. So what do we do? Well, in general, a few things. One, let's deal with Syria as it is, divided with an eye towards putting it back together. The regime alone does not have the manpower to take its own territory in the foreseeable future. The Russians and the Iranians are stuck with the regime in the western part of the country. We should understand that and use it to split these two allies apart. The U.S. should focus on ISIS and accelerate that effort, not just through bombing. The U.S. should also focus on continuing its support for the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-backed group in the country, while exploring options with the Turkish-backed Euphrates Shield, which has taken more territory in the last few months than was expected by nearly every analyst, including myself. We need to force a kick to ISIS out of these eastern areas of Syria and to reestablish a tribal-based system in that area that can institute a security and humanitarian regimen there and restore stability. Second, hard-nosed negotiations with the Russians. We need to see where there are possibilities in altering the regime's behavior, specifically on targeting civilians, as well as combating terrorism. I expect an early question will be if the U.S. and Russia can resurrect what was called the Joint Implementation Group Agreement, which was signed late last August or early September, but was stillborn as a result of an errant U.S. bombing in eastern Syria near Deir ez-Zor, and then a bombing by the Russians of a aid convoy going into Aleppo under mysterious circumstances. Third, another aspect of this hard-nosed diplomacy with Russia will be attempting to split their position from the Iranians, but because of the regime's limited manpower, it has to import more and more Shia militiamen to fight on the Assad regime's behalf. Russia and Russian aviation has supported this regime Shiite militia alliance until now. An early test for a Trump administration will be to determine if they are open to other options, which they say they are, be it a Syrian regime without Assad or a continued role or an expanded role for NATO ally Turkey in Syria, which recently set up a de facto safe zone in the northern part of Aleppo. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, all you panelists. You could see that there are differences of analysis and opinion amongst all these experts and former American officials. I forgot to mention that one of our panels today, a very interesting one, we Skyped in from Moscow a very prominent Russian, former Soviet, now Russian diplomat, who gave us the Russian perspective on the situation in Syria. It's someone that my colleagues and I have worked with, Alexander Zotov. So your questions, there are many. One I will address to anyone on the panel, a more philosophical starting question. An unexamined life is not worth living. What should the United States have done way back and in nearer times to avoid the crisis we're seeing in Syria today? Anyone want to take that on?
No.
All right, I'll go to the next question.
I'll venture. I think regime change has been a very bad policy. We believe that we could create better regimes than the terrible dictatorships that preside over most of the Middle East. And we haven't been able to do that. We haven't been able to put up better regimes. Instead, we've destroyed the very fragile state structures that have grown up since World War I, since this place was divided up after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And they have to start over again. It's a very long, difficult process of gathering legitimacy, authority, and it's being done at the end of a gun. And our attempts to put up an Iraqi government are really very similar to the attempts of the Russians to get up Assad once again after this revolt. We have bombed in favor of a very sectarian regime, and we might say we like the Iraqi regime better than the Syrian regime, and I'm sure that good argument can be made for that. But in Fallujah, in Ramadi, in Tikrit, 80% of the housing stock was destroyed after we bombed it, and the Shiite militias moved in and took revenge. And those people are all sitting out in the desert in big UN camps, drinking out of UN bottles in freezing cold weather. And maybe they'll go home, and maybe they won't. In Ramadi, I think 50% of the people have gone home, but many are terrified of going back because they're complicit with rebels against the Iraqi regime. And America is helping that because we want to destroy ISIS. Russia believes it's doing the same thing in Syria. And this is, I think that what we would do differently is be much more modest in our ambitions in the Middle East and not think that we know how Middle Easterners, and it can fix Middle Eastern situations. And supporting rebels in Syria was a bad idea. Assad won. We said he's going to fall. He's on the wrong side of history. He turned out to be, at least for now, on the right side of history, if you want to look at history as a brutal battle. Because maybe America's on the side of angels in the sense that we don't stand with him, but we have prolonged the civil war. It's going on 6 years. We've dumped in, and we've helped Saudis and Qataris and others dump in probably $20 billion, $15 to $20 billion of arms, weapons, training that has failed. But what it has done is help destroy Syria. Maybe Assad would have reconquered with Russia and Iran more quickly, which would have been brutal. But to lose the war and dump in 20 billion and then to dump people, that's not good. So we prolonged that war. And I think America, has taken, yes, we can tell ourselves it was all for good reasons and the road to perdition is paved with good intentions and all the other things we can pat ourselves on the back for not being on the same page as a dictator. But ultimately, there are a lot of lives that have been destroyed. And that is partly our doing.
I'd like to comment on your response.
Ambassador John, I would like to
yes,
say
Rhonda,
that in this case, in Syria, it's not us who demanded regime change. It's youth, people, it's women, it's children who went into the streets of Syria demanding regime change. So we did not go with tanks to cause regime change. What prolonged the war is us not supporting these people at critical turning points in the life cycle of this conflict when the right intervention or, what we promised we were going to do, could have supported their cause, could have helped them in achieving what they have set out to achieve. From the beginning, these people were not asking for the overthrow of the Assad regime. Let's remember that. The first demands in the streets of Damascus were to have a say in how their government is being run, was demands for participation, was demand for freedom from the writ of the security agencies, which still are, part of this regime, and that they are going to be even more of a say in the future of Syria. So I think what prolonged the war is not what we have done. What prolonged the war is what we have not done.
Okay, Ryan?
Could I just have a
Yes.
look? This stuff is really, really, really hard. Nothing easy about it. There are three ways you can approach these kinds of situations. One is to use military force to overthrow a regime and then to occupy the country. That's what we did in Iraq. Didn't go so well. A second way is to intervene militarily to overthrow a government and not occupy the country. That's what we did in Libya. That hasn't gone so well either. And of course, the third way is to not intervene militarily and not to occupy the country. That's what we did with our approach to Syria. None of them worked. So the next time you wake up in the morning saying, it really would be great for the United States to get rid of whoever we don't like at the moment, believe me, it is a gift that we'll keep on giving.
Very good comment. We have many questions on the potential with a new administration, the Trump administration coming up. The president-elect has indicated an interest in reestablishing a strategic dialogue with Russia. Much of what's happening in Syria today is being determined by Russian policy and Iranian policy and Hezbollah, as our panelists have mentioned. But the basic questions, we have several questions on this, is what are the merits of the new administration going into a structural dialogue with Russia over Syria? Robert.
Couple of quick points, and then I think, as the audience can see, others on the panel will chime in. So, three thoughts on talking to the Russians about Syria. Number one, it's a good idea. It's a good idea. Russia has interests in Syria. Russia's much closer to Syria than we are. Russia has a long-standing relationship with the government of Bashar al-Assad, and before him, his father. They have interests there. Second comment, just talking to them probably won't change their minds about how they operate. If they did, John Kerry would have convinced them a long time ago and would not have had to make constant, repeated trips, fruitless trips, to places like Geneva and Vienna and Lausanne. So just talking to them, I think it's a good thing, but understand the limitations of it. In a war, usually military pressure, direct, Ryan was talking about, or indirect, working with local forces on the ground, usually counts for something in a dialogue. Third thing, and we talked about this quite a bit today in our group, one of the reasons the Russians want to talk to us is because Syria is largely destroyed. Those of you who saw the movie Saving Private Ryan and the scenes in the movie of Europe destroyed, that's kind of what Aleppo looks like now, large parts of Aleppo. It's what the suburbs of Damascus, which used to be home to several million people, that's what those suburbs look like now. City of Homs, the third largest city, has suffered similar damage. The Russians don't want to pay for the reconstruction. The Russians want us to pay for the reconstruction. Foreign Minister Lavrov was quoted in the press about 6 weeks ago saying the United States should do a new Marshall Plan and this time for Syria. So we should understand that the Russians have some big asks of us, even though they're running their military campaign without consulting us at all. So I'll stop there, Ed.
Okay. Several questions on the Kurdish issue. What role will Syria's Kurds play in the future of the region? We have some expertise here on that, and who would like to take that on? Charles.
I can give it a first go. Complicated subject. It's complicated. When ISIL took over Mosul and launched their march across Iraq in 2014, the United States was faced with very few options to push back against their offensive there. One of those options that sort of provided itself very quickly was the Syrian YPG, through their political wing, the PYD. Make no mistake, this organization is quite explicitly the Syrian affiliate of the PKK, which our own government has designated as an international terrorist organization. But we were faced with this option to use these forces to push back against ISIL in parts of western Iraq, and then later, as we know, in northeastern Syria. These forces have done an excellent job, despite the controversial nature of picking them as our favored anti-ISIL partner. The problem is, of course, is the destabilizing effect that has had more broadly across northern Syria. The YPG has a fraught relationship with the Assad regime. They still share power in the city of Qamishli in the northeast with the Assad regime. They very rarely have fought it. But the real inherent problem we have is the fact that the entirety of Syria's opposition views the YPG as a sort of existential threat to Syria's territorial integrity. And what we've also seen more recently is the Assad regime starting to talk in exactly the same language, fearing that this organization is eventually going to want to split off or have some kind of autonomy from the Syrian state. And I think that is, through our own actions as the United States government, going to become almost an inevitability. And we are going to have to face this question of what the YPG is permitted to do politically. They already have their own effective constitution. They already have their own educational curriculum. They're not teaching Arabic in northeastern Syria. They're teaching Kurdish. And this is a reality that the Trump administration will have to face. I don't have an answer for it. The one thing in my experience talking to Syrians on all sides of the conflict is actually the irony in that Syrian unity and rejecting a partition is probably the only thing that unifies Syrians on either side of the conflict, with the exception of the YPG, who naturally take a somewhat different position. But through our own actions, we've made it inevitable that partition question or autonomy question has become an issue we're going to have to address. I honestly don't know how we are going to address it. I don't think it's in the United States' interest to see Syria partitioned in any form. But the Kurdish rise in confidence is a reality on the ground now. And the last thing I'll say on this, of course, is probably the thing I should have mentioned from the very beginning. Our NATO ally, Turkey, sees the PKK and has seen the PKK for several decades as an existential national security threat. And of course, as Turkey's NATO ally, we have dramatically emboldened this force across its border in Syria, which is why we've seen Turkey invade another portion of northern Syria to make sure that this Kurdish organization essentially couldn't control the entirety of Syria's northern border. That's another complication that we're going to face in terms of relations with Turkey. So in terms of my opening comments, in terms of ground truths, that's certainly another one that the Trump administration is going to have to face, but that with no easy answers.
I'd just like to say that I think the United States owes it to the Kurds not to let them get completely destroyed by Turkey or the Syrian government. They have helped us in the battle against ISIS. They've established their own national institutions, their educational institutions, and they want what the Kurds have in northern Iraq, which we helped them get. And I don't see any constructive reason that we should allow them to be reoccupied either by Turkey, a Turkish army, or the Syrian army. Obviously, some kind of fig leaf situation where they don't become independent because we are trying to keep Syria integral is important, as the fig leaf situation exists in Iraq. But that can be arranged without allowing the Turks to drive their army into regions of the Kurdish, or Assad for that matter. And I think turning our backs on the Kurds at this point would help nobody.
There was an interesting consensus in the group that the territorial disintegration of Syria and its Sykes-Picot boundaries is not a determined or necessary outcome of what we're seeing. There may be massive decentralization or something short of the disintegration of the state. We'll see. Last question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. What can the United States do to decrease the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Ryan. That's why you're paid all the big bucks when you're in government. You know, that's.
Well, Ed, it's complicated. It's a good question because it brings in several themes we've been talking about here. There is a Middle Eastern Cold War going on, which is obviously which the question assumes, and that is between Saudi Arabia, the leading Sunni Muslim power in the area, and Iran, the leading Shia Muslim power in the area. And that, when you understand that, then you can understand a little bit better some of the hot wars taking place beneath it, like Yemen. Saudis backing the last government, the Iranians backing their principal opponent. You see it clearly in Syria. You see it in Iraq, where the Iranians have taken advantage of our absence to form a large number of really horrific militias. So what do you do about it? Well, first, do not buy into the talk radio narrative that, well, Sunnis and Shia have always been fighting each other. It's as old as Islam. It won't change. There's nothing we can do about it. Actually, in my career experience, I have seen the opposite. As we were trying to get ourselves out of Vietnam, then President Nixon felt that a new security architecture was necessary, that we never wanted to do another Vietnam. Instead, we would look to regional powers to maintain security and stability in their own neighborhoods. We would support them with weapons, with training, with economic assistance as needed, but we would stay out of any fights. What two countries did we turn to in the Middle East? Iran and Saudi Arabia. And in the last decade of the Shah's rule, through the 1970s, it worked really well, to the extent that the Saudis supported and facilitated the deployment of an Iranian mechanized infantry brigade into the Arabian Peninsula. So it's just an illustration that this is not carved in stone. What should we do today? First, let's separate the forces of order from the forces of disorder. We don't have the luxury of saying that we will support democracies against autocracies. That's part of international relations. There are very few purely good choices, and there certainly isn't one here. Forces of order would be our traditional friends: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Turkey. Forces of disorder: Iran and Russia. So let's shore up our defenses with our traditional friends, and then see what we all can come up with together as a fresh approach to a desperately bleeding region. But right now, that's not where we are. our relationships have deteriorated with all those countries that I just mentioned, every single one of them. So the Trump administration is going to have I think, a huge priority decision to make. That's what I talked about at the beginning. Are we going to back away from the post-World War II order we created and oversaw? Hasn't worked that well for the region or for us. Or are we going to engage? And if we are going to engage, with whom? I would say the forces of order, and let that drive a discussion on what the policy of this administration will be for the next 4 years.
Well, and on that assessment, I want to join me, please, in thanking our panelists for a stimulating discussion. Thank you. Well done. We got to get out of here.